at this point.
I'd like to call the Rules and City Government Committee meeting to order. Oh, jeez. For the record, Alderman Savage and Alderman Arnett are present and accounting for. Why is it there? The nursing home always calls at this hour. Okay, and so I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda with the modification of moving 32 and 34 to the beginning of the legislative action.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Next item is approval of the minutes from the October 13th meeting. And thank you, Takia, for getting those out to us. We appreciate it.
I was going to say, Madam Chair, with great admiration for Takia Green, I move we approve the minutes.
Thank you.
I'll second that, and good job. I've looked at them, and there's a lot to catch, and you caught it all, so thank you.
So, okay, all in favor of approving the minutes as written, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, so legislative items. We'll begin with 03221, zoning code, use occupancy permits. Alderman Savage, I thought this was yours. It's
No.
not.
Oh, it's Mayor Buckley's.
Mayor Buckley's.
But
Dr. Nash, could you speak to this?
Yes, this is a piece of legislation that the Departments of Public Works and Planning and Zoning has requested to make sure that our use and occupancy permit process, where we allow people occupancy of a completed structure, is coordinated better with the Department of Public Works procedures for grading approvals. Because sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect because a building might be ready for someone to move in, but all the stormwater management, all the plantings might not be finished depending on the time of year or just the general schedule of the project. So this will help us make sure that those processes dovetail better together. Although I have asked for a few amendments that are in my staff report to the Planning Commission, just little tweaks to make it sure it makes more sense.
I'm not seeing any amendments, Dr. Nash.
They haven't been put into amendment form, but I can go through them.
Alderman Arnett?
first of all, I move we recommend approval, but I do have a question for the director. Given the bind we're in and the huge agenda we
Alderman,
have.
I'm going to ask you to wait just one moment until Dr. Nash finishes her presentation for us. Not presentation, but her report. Because she may have covered whatever you're...
Well, I was going to ask if this slips to the next term, is that critical?
No, it's not that time sensitive.
So my preference would be to actually see the amendments in amendment form so that we could deliberate on them.
Well, I'm asking her right now to present to us what those amendments are. We'll get the general sense. If you choose not to endorse them here, you can wait until the general meeting, but I'd like for her to present. She said they're in the drafting phase, so.
That's right. I just need to find a sponsor, but I suspect I could get the mayor to do that. So the first one is just adding as applicable in a certain case, because what we want to do isn't necessarily applicable in all situations. And actually, I'm sorry, that's the only little addition we have. So it's just the insertion of 2 words. And I will definitely make sure that gets drafted into an amendment.
And specifically, are you talking about Are you referring to page 2 of the legislation?
Page 4.
Oh, I'm sorry, there is one more amendment that was actually recommended by the Planning Commission, and that was just to clarify that with the exception of non-multifamily residential units, when there's a change in ownership of a structure, we need a new use and occupancy. So 2 fairly minor technical. They are, the second one the Planning Commission recommended is on page 2, line 11. And instead of it saying single dwelling units, we want to change that to non-multifamily residential units.
Is that in recognition of the ADUs?
No, that's just so we make sure that when a large property like the Watergate, for example, changes ownership, we want to make sure we capture that change in ownership on our use and occupancy permit. But we don't really want to know when a single-family home changes hands for as far as use and occupancy goes.
So the 2 amendments would be the 2 that are indicated in the Planning Commission's recommendations. I'm not seeing the first one stated, though. I see the second one.
I think they did not capture the first one that staff wanted, the as applicable. But that one would be on page 4 of the ordinance, lines 3 through 6. And we just want to insert the words as applicable after grading and building permits.
So, Alderman Savage?
I mean, we can make the motion from the floor to,
Well, the motion
For
on
the
the floor is
amendment.
to give a favorable recommendation. Do we want to amend that motion to include the 2 amendments Dr. Nash is bringing to us?
that's fine with me.
Is there a second to the motion?
You did,
Oh,
there was a second.
I'll
You made the
I'll second
motion,
the
he
original
seconded
motion,
it.
yeah.
Alderman Arnett? Are you good with
With the 2
amending
amendments?
Yes.
Is the staff going to capture these in, when they actually put this before the council Monday? Yes,
I
I'm
will
good.
send them to Jacqueline Lee.
Yes, I'm good with that.
Okay, thank you.
I think she said that they were in the drafting stage right now, so. Okay, Alderman Savage, did you have something else to add, or is it?
No, I just wondering, if you want to make those amendments, put them on the floor now, I'm happy to
Right.
do that, to come from the
So do we
committee.
have to dispatch with the first motion and then go back to amended?
Yes, because Alderman Arnett recommended favorably, and your second was for his recommendation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then you just vote on that.
Okay, so the.
Well, actually, no, don't vote on it yet. You'll do that part at the end.
Say that again?
Don't vote on recommending favorably.
Well, that's
So
what I was
got the
asking.
second,
So
right.
we take the
So now you
amendment.
can take the amendment.
Okay, so the amendment, I need a motion to amend the amendment to include the 2 that Dr. Nash just referenced, with an understanding that we'll get a written copy of those before Monday's meeting.
Yeah, I would like to move that we recommend the amendments that are from the planning commission and from staff.
Second?
Okay. Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the 2 amendments as outlined by Dr. Nash, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so that takes us back to the original motion to give a favorable recommendation for 032 now as
As amended.
amended.
Aye.
The motion is, we have to amend the motion to include the amendment, the amendment to the amendment. So is that, would you accept that as a friendly
Yes.
amendment?
Yes.
Okay, and the second?
Second.
Accept? Okay, so all in favor of The amendment for 032, please say aye.
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 And that is amendment as it's amended. Okay. That takes us to 034, forest conservation, reforestation. Alderman Savage, I do believe this one is yours.
Yes, Madam Chair, would you like me to give an explanation?
Please.
So what precipitated this is just, my intent with this is to close what are two potential loopholes that have come apparent over the years. And the loopholes are just essentially provisions that would prevent the full acknowledgement of realization of the no-net loss. And so the first loophole, and let me bring up the legislation.
Could you begin on page 2? That's the first one that I see.
Yep, bring it up
That
now. Page
Deals
2.
with the time, I believe.
Yes, so this provision, it would require that, so the thing it's intended to catch is when there's a property, a forested property, and somebody could clear half an acre, quarter acre, every few months, every year, and it wouldn't trigger any kind of, it wouldn't trigger our forest conservation laws because those don't trigger until an acre is cleared. And so this would catch it where if somebody clears a little bit of forest over the time and then submits a building or a construction grading permit to build on the property, that they would have to factor in the forest that was cleared, and that would have to be included into their forest stand delineation. So when the consultant goes out to the property and puts together a forest stand delineation, they go out and characterize the forest, assess its health, this would just say that consultants would need to look to see, they would look on aerials, they would look at the site to see if forest was removed in the past few years, in this case, 10 years.
10 years, it looks like.
And so we did have something like this happen not in the city, but in the county, where there were a couple of large trees that were cleared prior to a development application. And so I'm just trying to avoid that situation in the city.
Well, let me ask, is there a problem in the city that we're trying to fix here?
Well, one of the things that this would address would be if there's and it kind of gets addressed later on as well, because this is connected to the other provision, is that one example is the Rocky Gorge project where forest was cleared and then it changed ownership. And so what we want to ensure and have it be clear in the code is that the new owner would be obligated to honor the mitigation from the previous forest conservation plan and approvals. All right, because if they're not obligated to replace it, then we would have essentially lost that whole area of forest that they cleared and it won't get replaced. Now, I've spoken with staff about this, and I don't think they would not have allowed that to happen anyway. But the point is, this would at least clarify it in the law to give the staff that extra support to say you can go ahead and make sure that previous clearing of forests have to be honored by new owners if it's associated with, and this typically if it's associated with any kind of new development that's being proposed.
Okay, I didn't hear what I mean, I know what your intent is. I didn't hear the problem we're trying to fix. So this is just, or maybe I'll ask Dr. Nash, how doable, a 10-year period, it seems like a long time in my mind, but maybe it's not.
As was discussed yesterday at Environmental Matters, staff has concerns about that time period. We would prefer it to go back to the date of the last forest stand delineation, because we just don't have a reliable and accurate way to gather information from 10 or 15 years as amended. So it's it's tricky for us. We can't really look at an aerial photo and know exactly what's happened on a site, especially as it pertains to the forest stand delineation and any changes that might have occurred. And so we would prefer to have a document that has previously been submitted and approved by our office to use as a reference.
So how does that coincide with what you're asking for, Alderman? Knowing that staff,
Well, I don't mind adjusting the year period, but I don't think it's not going to work to have it tied to a previous forest end delineation, because in many instances, the only time somebody's going to put together a forest end delineation is if they actually put a development proposal application in the works. What this is trying to factor in are those sites where somebody buys a forest and doesn't have any declaration of wanting to develop it, but they buy the forest and clear it over the years, so they don't have to do the forest mitigation, and they don't have to do a forest end delineation again. So in that case scenario, they would have cleared the entire lot, and then they submit a building application, and then they complete the forest end delineation. But if we link it to a previous forest end delineation, it wouldn't work because there wasn't one that was completed. And so again, I have no problem adjusting the years. Even if we want to do 5 years, I think that'd be fine. But I think the analysis would fall mostly on the weight of the consultant. And this is what I used to do as a consultant. We'd go out there on the property, do a full site analysis, look at the aerials, look at the site to determine what features have been altered and what the history is, speak to the property owners, that kind of thing. And so that would be done by the consultant, turned over to city staff, and city staff would do the verification process.
okay. Dr. Nash?
I feel like I've stated staff's position on it. I feel like if the intent is to regulate people clearing smaller amounts of forest than what would trigger an FSD, it would be easier for staff to change the law to make it so you couldn't do that without some kind of approvals. Whereas now you are allowed to clear up to a certain amount without a forest stand delineation, and this would try to go back retroactively and make people mitigate for that. I think it'd make more sense to just say, if you want to clear any forest over a certain amount, you have to do this amount of mitigation.
What's this?
Alderman Savage?
I mean, I'm certainly open to that, and we've talked about that before, but the problem with that is if we lower the threshold, that is gonna increase the workload on staff a lot more than this would. And it also is, no matter what threshold you pick, somebody's always gonna be able to clear less to get around the law. And this, because the intention with this is you deliberately tie it to a development proposal, so they can't get around any of the regulations. So I would think that this would work better for staff than lowering that threshold.
Okay. Alderman Arnett?
Madam Chair, I suggest that the Planning Commission did take this up, and they actually made a recommendation to go from 10 years to 15 years. Mr. Waldman is here. I don't know if he cares to speak to that. And that is Amendment 3 of the Savage Amendments 1 through 3. The Planning Director is correct. We did have some significant discussion about this, and we talked about this whole problem for the staff and being able to go back retroactively. But on the other hand, I think Alderman Savage is correct. If they haven't applied for any forest stand delineation or any other thing, there would be no documentation to go back to. So I think that we're kind of in a rub here. I am sympathetic to the staff. and I am also sympathetic to what Alderman Savage is, the onus is on the applicant when they come in, but I don't know how we enforce all of that either.
Okay, well, let's go to the amendments.
Oh, come on.
And we do have the Planning Commission's report, and then Alderman Savage, you have 3 amendments to your legislation?
Yes, Madam Chair. Let's see, Amendment 1. So Amendment 1, Dr. Nash may want to talk to. This largely came from them. Basically, this restores language that I had originally proposed to strike, but through discussions with staff, it was better to keep it in. So this just kind of restores what was originally in the code.
I'm trying to find the amendment. I'm looking at Amendment 1.
Madam Chair, if I may, it is confusing. Amendment 1 is at the top, and then underneath it, it shows you how it would read as amended.
Well, I'm looking for the difference, or there is no difference.
No, it's just that the as amended shows you the entire section of the code in section III. So it would begin with when all other options, and then it includes the amendment. Same thing for the amendment 2.
Okay, so are you moving these amendments individually or collectively?
Well, I'd like to move the first 2. So if I could move a favorable recommendation for Amendments 1 and 2.
Second?
1 and 2,
Yes.
you said? Is there further discussion? Alderman, why the 35 feet?
That's what's currently in the code.
Now, this looks like new language, so where is?
Well, it was reworded, but the current code says it ensures that the mitigation is done in an equivalent manner. And so it just says at least the mitigation has to establish a forest at least 35 feet wide and covering at least 2,500 square feet of area. That's in the code as written. I'd originally proposed to remove it, but staff pointed out that it's helpful to have it in there. So I decided to reverse that change.
So is this page 5, line 17, 18?
Yes, 16 through 18.
Okay. Dr. Nash?
We support amendments 1 and 2.
Okay. Further discussion? Okay, so the motion on the floor is to give a favorable recommendation to amendments, the Savage amendments 1 and 2. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, amendment number 3.
Well, so just in background, the Environmental Matters Committee decided not to take action on that amendment. This one, just to explain, would be, so this is essentially the Planning Commission recommendation to go to 15 years instead of 10 years when you look in the past. And so just based on our conversation with staff, I don't want to come across as tone deaf. I want to hear their concerns. They had concerns about 15 especially, so we decided not to move forward with taking a position on that amendment.
Who did you say took no position on it?
Environmental Matters Committee?
Environmental Matters took no position on it? Dr. Nash?
This speaks to the issue we were discussing before. I don't support this amendment. I think 15 years is way too far back. We really don't have accurate information for 15 years back.
Yeah, and Madam Chair, to the Planning Commission, I always appreciate when people want to go more aggressive than I on the environment, but so thank you, but we're trying to find a bit of a middle ground on some of these.
Okay, further discussion? Motion on the floor is to, was there a motion?
No,
No, there is no motion.
so we'll take
There
no
is no
action.
motion. We'll take no position on amendment number 3. Okay, so the motion on the floor, there should be a motion on the floor. I entertain a motion.
The motion, I
To
would
give a
move,
favorable recommendation, or to give a recommendation for 034 as amended with 2 of the Savage amendments. 1
so
and 2.
that is my motion.
I'll second that motion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. All right, that takes us back to 02521. Waterfront Maritime Zoning Districts. We have dealt with amendments 1 through 14. So we are on amendment 15 now. And I believe Alderman Schandelmeyer is withdrawing 15. Yes, it says it's withdrawn.
Correct.
Okay, so amendment 16, which is the Arnett amendment. Alderman Arnett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is an amendment to more fully define what we mean by public water access. This is the work of the Planning Commission, and I believe this was drafted by a member of the Planning Commission, a member of the task force. I subscribe to this. I think that it's important to more fully define what we mean by water access. And this is offered in substitution of definition that is in the Buckley-Tierney amendments. Is it 3? Trying to find. This is on page 21. 9. Amendment 9, okay, yes. Yes, so it would only replace in Amendment 9 the section that is referring to page 21, line 20. And this would be a substitute for that. Otherwise, it does not affect the rest of Amendment 9, which I believe we had already approved in this body, in this committee. So it is to take that one section of Amendment 9 from the Buckley-Tierney, and what it essentially does is expand more fully the meaning of water access. So I would move we accept Amendment 16 favorably.
What was second?
Alderman, I'm afraid you're going to have to go through that again, because I'm looking at Amendment 9, but I'm not seeing where Amendment 16 would interface.
In Amendment 9, if you go down 2/3 of the page, you'll see there's an amendment on page 21 after line 20. This is inserting definitions. And in Amendment 9, there is a definition of public water access. We started working on wording of that when we were discussing Amendment 9, and I've come back with Amendment 16 that would substitute in Amendment number 9 the words that are supposed to be inserted on page 21, line 20, the newer, more fully expansive language that you see in Amendment 16.
So in essence, your amendment is to replace Amendment 9, page 21, line 20.
Exactly, that part of Amendment 9. It doesn't change anything else in Amendment 9.
Who's the sponsor of Amendment 9?
Tierney Buckley.
And have you conferred with them as to the acceptance of your amendment as a friendly amendment to them?
With Alderwoman Tierney, yes, and also with the staff. As you know, the mayor is hard to get a hold of.
This time of year isn't everyone.
Yes, I know.
Dr. Nash, do you see any issues with the substitution?
There's some concern about the term reasonableness and who actually gets to decide that amount.
I'm trying to find that.
I would like to quote the immortal words of
Excuse me,
Mr.
would you
Nolan.
identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. Robert Waldman, member of the task force and also from the Planning Commission, 1001 Poplar Avenue in Annapolis. I'd like to quote the immortal words of Mr. Nolan at the last session of this committee when he said, "The words reasonable are an invitation to lawyers to start charging." And I'm a little concerned about defining what, real public access is and who can decide what's reasonable. And I do think that there should be language in there that at least the director of planning and zoning, can resolve any problems that come up. I'm concerned that some property owner will say, "Oh, I've provided a pathway from the street to the water and no more," when there's certainly potential for a much more meaningful public access. And that property owner can say, "Well, this is all I'm required to do." So it's that language concerns me a little bit. I think that, there was tremendous interest in repeatedly we've heard, increasing public access. And clearly we want to do it in ways that don't impinge on the operations of businesses. But then we also need to push them to give us promenades and the like, when that's possible. So I'm a little concerned. It's too easy to argue endlessly over what's reasonable. I just think that you might consider adding an amendment that says, any the Department of Planning and Zoning can resolve any. How can I put this? But
Dr. Nash, what would the implication or the impact be if the term reasonable were taken out of at least the two locations that I'm looking at in the amendment?
So reasonable seems to refer to restrictions in this case that can be placed on the water access. The access may be subject to reasonable restrictions to address public safety concerns and shall include clear signage denoting the allowed public use and any such reasonable restrictions. I think we need to highlight the issue of public safety here, because I think that is what we would use to restrict any access. We would be looking at public safety issues. I think we could probably add, the access may be subject to reasonable restrictions to address public safety concerns and shall include clear signage denoting the allowed public use and any such reasonable restrictions as determined by the Director of Planning and Zoning.
So you're saying that the use of the term reasonable is defined by the public safety restrictions?
I think the reasonable is okay, but I think we need to add an agent who it is clear that who is exercising the reasonableness.
Alderman
Deciding-
Arnett, this is your amendment. How are you, given what Dr. Nash has shared?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So as I understand it, the second to last sentence at the end where it says restrictions, we would add a clause as determined by the Director of Planning and Zoning, and I am very favorably inclined to that addition to the amendment.
Now I'm looking at, because the term is used twice,
It's
the
all,
access may be subject to reasonable restrictions to address public safety concerns.
it's all in the same sentence.
It's all in the same sentence, you're right.
Right.
So where would your,
At the end of that sentence, where it says such reasonable restrictions, period, insert before the period, comma, as determined by the Director of Planning and Zoning. I think that's a very good addition. And I
Dr.
would look
Nash?
to the two authors.
Mr. Waldman, is that acceptable as? Yes. Okay.
Good.
Can I
So,
second that?
Alderman Savage?
Can I second that?
Yeah, well, it's his amendment, so he
You're
doesn't
just
have to.
changing it,
He
okay.
doesn't need a second to amend his own amendment.
Right.
So, but your amendment that you have just amended includes, say that again?
The clause after the second to last sentence, which ends with such reasonable restrictions, you would insert comma, as determined by the Director of Planning and Zoning, period.
Ms. Green, did you get that? No. After, the next to the last sentence, before the period, after restrictions, such reasonable restrictions, comma, as,
Thank you. While we're making sausage.
okay. Alderman Savage, you second. Do we have a motion on the floor? Yes. Okay,
I think I seconded it already.
yeah, okay. Further discussion on Amendment 16? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Amendment 17.
So, Madam,
Alderman Arnett,
Yes.
mine is not opening up, so I don't,
do you have a hard copy with,
Are we on, we're on
okay.
17?
okay.
right.
Have a hard copy, I'm good.
So Amendment 17 refers back to page 3, where we're discussing the waterfront access initiatives. And it is meant to be a substitution for everything in the original ordinance from line 32 through to page 4, line 17. The water access initiatives were spoken to and are part of the task force strategy that we adopted by resolution, I believe it is 4621. But a lot of this is also affected by the work of the Planning Commission. And the Planning Commission really took up the cause of water access. And in the original legislation, you can see that a lot of these incentives are small, 1%. And what I'm proposing here is to make the incentives for the flexibility large enough that it might actually incent somebody to do that, to take advantage of these flexibilities. And I would also note in passing that these are quite similar to the kinds of things that in the Schneidermeyer amendments, Brooks was talking about a lot of these changes to increase the incentives, and I subscribe to that. I am somewhat arbitrary in saying 2.5% across the board, but the nice thing about 2.5% is you can do 2 of them and reach the 5% cap in this legislation. And the one thing that this does to the original legislation is to take out line 41, which was an incentive for a boat slip for the city. And there was discussion, particularly at the Planning Commission, that that's probably not something that we want to do in code. So, and then if you go to the category 2, the change here is to increase the amount that you can get from waterfront incentives from another 5% cap to a 10% cap. And believe me, I have agonized over it, and if you look at the comments from the Eastport Civic Association that you received today, you know, these are things that are much on people's minds. But if you look on the back page, and you are, what I have done in discussions with the community, this amendment to go from 50 to 150 on-site parking spaces is particularly valuable to the community. And so I've upped that from 5% to 10%. And then if you'll skip G for a second and go to H, the community boating facility with small vessel storage, that's another one that is something that gives residents a big advantage in terms of being able to have, instead of carrying their kayak over to water, they would be able to have a place to store it, have a locker, have a place to have their paddles and oars and all of those sorts of things. So I boosted that to 10% in this amendment. There's some other changes that are important, but I want to return back to on the second page, item G, and you'll again see the discussion from the Civic Association, and it's something that I have been worrying about. It seems to me that for well-heeled people to stroke a one-time only check of $150,000 is kind of on the small side. At the Maritime Advisory Board a few meetings ago, we heard from the harbor master that the cost to just do one floating dock from planning to installation, I believe the number was around $144,000. And so that's just one floating dock at one area. So it felt to me like, and this is obviously a debatable issue, that should go up to 250. The other change here that you go, if you go back to the first page, is technical beyond belief. But if we don't add this new wording that I have in red here in the WMM, 30% of the gross floor area of the developable area on the lot in existence, for some of the parcels in the WMM, if we don't have this language as it is, the effect of the amendment is to reduce the amount of their flexibility, not increase the amount of their flexibility. I know this gets into very technical weeds, but I think this is a very important thing. And it is important for a couple of senses. In a couple of senses, it does allow an increase of the non-maritime to go to 55% in the WMM only, which is a very controversial issue. And as you can see from the comments from the Civic Association that are my constituents, they would like to hold the line at 50. It's something that Alderman Savage and I have gone back and forth on. Here's how and I know I'm being a little long-winded, but this is how I look at it. The overall intent of the recommendations from the task force and the enhancements from the Planning Commission is to give flexibility in the maritime industry. And in particular in the WMM, where you know I already felt that there were problems, this allows them to fill spaces that otherwise, because of the restriction of the current code, would be empty, and therefore doing nothing either for the maritime industry or for the property owners would not provide jobs and would not provide additional tax revenue. So I have been agonizing with all of the different trade-offs, but for me, what the community, and in particular my community, since this affects the Ward 8, what the community gains in water access from this change is a very powerful sop to the things that we would lose. The real impact of this, and I think Ms. Templeton, who's here, gave us a couple of meetings ago, is it allows for an additional approximately 3,500 square feet at the Annapolis City Marina and approximately 3,100 square feet of non-maritime office space in the WP nautical space at 222 Severn. These are spaces that are largely not visible to the public, but are very important to the property owners to be able to continue to maintain and cross-subsidize the maritime operation. So I know I was long, but this is a complicated amendment, but I think that these changes are important, and those would be substituted from the changes in the Buckley-Tierney amendments. Oh, somebody help me.
Is Amendment 2 Alderwoman Tierney's amendment?
Yes, I think that's right. Yes, Amendment 2. This group has already taken up Amendment 2, and where she offers to put 55, we voted to keep it at 50. I'm now changing my position in saying I'm comfortable in the WMM of moving that up to 55 because of the positive benefits of this water access of Category 1 and Category 2.
Tell me something. The language that you've given us in the form of your Amendment 17, is this language from Alderwoman Tierney's amendment?
No, this is a substitute for the Tierney amendments.
Well, not all of it, only
Not all
what's
of it,
in red.
only for those things in the Tierney amendment where it starts off at the beginning, page 3, line 32.
But is that, my question is what I'm looking at, page 3, line 32, in the document you gave us,
Correct.
is that Alderwoman Tierney's
This would be,
amendment?
this would be a
to-
substitute for her amendment 2.
My question is, what you have included in red is what you are inserting into Alderwoman Tierney's amendment. Is that correct?
Now, this entire, oh, this gets so
It would
complicated.
It's not
this-
complicated.
This would
It is-
substitute.
This is
amendment.
the whole thing.
How much of
Everything,
this?
all of
It would,
this.
it would be.
Red,
Yeah.
Let me ask my question before you give me the answer. How much of this comes from Alderwoman Tierney's? What I'm assuming is that what's in black is Alderwoman Tierney's amendment number 2. And what you are inserting, correcting, or amending is in red. Is that incorrect?
That is, yes, that is an incorrect interpretation.
Okay, so then help me understand what I'm looking at, please.
You should look at this as though it were all in black and all as a substitute. The reason for the red is because I initially submitted to the planning staff and to the Office of Law something that did not have these embellishments that I have in red. So the red is because of what was initially submitted back on the 15th to the Office of Law and was drafted. But the entirety of this, whether it's red or black, as long as in capitals, is meant to be a substitution for the Tierney Amendment number 2. Just the very first section of it. There's other things where there's donate and one-time payment. Let's see. Yeah, so let's see if it does. Page 4, line 7, after donate. Yeah, this does not speak to that. On the Tierney Amendment, the page 4, line 13, that describes the fee paid for the people who get this additional flexibility into the Annapolis Maritime Industry Fund. So it does not affect that. I guess I would look to Eric in particular to make sure you understand what I'm attempting to do here. And the effect of this is where we discussed throughout the legislation where there was 10% or 15% throughout. This makes all of those 10% 15%. Help me, somebody.
Question to the alderman. Is the intent, I believe the intent is, just to make sure we're clear on it, it was initially tied to the 15% non-maritime flexibility given in conjunction with the triggers. This language would tie it to all non-maritime flexibility. Is that correct?
Yes. Originally, the task force recommended 50%, no more, not going below 50%, and only a 10% flexibility for these waterside incentives.
Correct.
The Planning Commission recommended being more generous in order to encourage more people to take advantage of these incentives. So this language is intended to reflect what the Planning Commission recommended over and above what the task force recommended.
Yes, we understand.
Is everybody's head hurting?
Yes. Sure, Mr. Oh. Could you identify yourself and give your address, please?
Put the mic on.
Oh, your microphone's not on.
James P. Nolan, 55 Arundel Road, Annapolis, Maryland, 21401 is my residence, and 125 West Street is my office address. Just a question for Alderman Arnett. You're proposing to increase Category 2G one-time payment from $125,000, which was what was proposed, to $250,000. So my question is, would there be a corresponding increase in the percentage of incentive from 5% at 125 to 10% at 250,000?
That was not my intent, no.
Okay.
So I was responding to the ECA comments on the legislation where they recommended increasing it from 150 to 250.
Can that be considered?
Well, of course it can be considered. This is the body to consider it until we get to the council.
Requesting that it be considered.
Yeah.
With a big increase or doubling of the dollar amount, it just sort of seems consistent to increase the incentive percentage similarly, which would put it in line with the others that are proposed.
I am, to answer you directly, I'm resistant to that. I am actually resistant to this incentive, a one-time only for 50 years of use, when we know that this is, even at a street inn, as written, the legislation wouldn't even provide one floating dock. Just seems like a major giveaway. So for me, upping the amount and keeping the weight the same is what I'm comfortable with. I'm only one of 9 votes, and so I like it the way it's submitted, but I understand what you're asking, and my answer is I like the bigger number with the same weight.
Well, you've certainly answered the question and clarified it. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Bob has-
May I, Mr. Savage?
1 moment, committee member, Alderman Savage, are you on the same topic or same,
Well,
still on this?
well, I just wanted to at some point get thoughts. I have my own thoughts, but I wanted to hear from the task force and staff
You what?
I wanted to hear from the task force and the staff at some point.
You will.
as well. Okay.
Seth Laner, 102 Eastern Avenue. Mr. Arnett, you mentioned a minute ago a couple of square footage figures referencing the Annapolis City Marina, and I believe 222.7. Would you repeat those?
My understanding is that 5% of 75,000 square feet, and I'm trying to do the math in my head, was like 3,500 square feet. And I believe that WP Nautical is 67,000 square feet, and I think that comes out to about 3,100 square feet. But I don't have my calculator in front of me, so I'm.
The numbers that you stated were 5%.
5% additional flexibility for the office space in existence at the time of passage.
So that's an increase above and beyond the existing, correct? So you take the increase of, if I'm not mistaken, the WMM today is 30%?
Yes, this would be.
Okay, so then we go from 30% to 50%. And then with your amendment, we go from 50% to 55%. So we're essentially going from 30 to 55%, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. Have you ever done the calculations on the full zoning for all zoning parcels?
Actually, I have not, but I've asked the staff to do that.
The task force or a different
That
staff?
is the staff, the city staff.
Okay.
I think that is in their province, not mine.
Have they responded with when they will provide you with results of that
We're working
request?
on it.
Is that something we would have before Monday?
You'd have to ask that of the staff. I have my.
Okay, it just seems to me that we're talking about an awful lot of space, commercial space, and these are some big numbers, right?
Those are the two biggest commercial spaces that I know of in all of the maritime zones, and certainly are the two big commercial spaces in the WMM where these incentives are directed.
Okay. One last question. To your knowledge, Ms. Finlayson or Mr. Arnett, has the task force or the city also contemplated commercial properties which are not waterfront but in the respective zones that we're discussing?
I know the task force did, and I know you could be referring to some of those maritime properties that are off of Severn Avenue but do not front onto the water. And yes, those are certainly properties, but I would ask the task force representatives to speak to that. I know they did talk about it.
I only point out the obvious, that obviously those particular parcels have no ability to provide waterfront access regardless, correct?
That is correct.
So they would be subject to these amendments and the various legislation, even though they cannot physically provide any of those. There's no possible way for which them to provide a waterfront access if they in fact are not on the water. So I've been under the understanding that we mostly are discussing, if not fully discussing, only waterfront related maritime zone properties. Is that a fair?
I mean, I think that's a fair characterization, but I would turn to the task force.
The task force was very concerned that these incentives, but wanted to make sure that these incentives applied to all properties so that all properties have access to these incentives. Some of them, certainly waterfront properties, would have access, and some of the non-waterfront properties might have been interested in, buying into some of these, but they apply to all properties in the districts.
Understood. I'm just pointing out that those parcels have no way by which to participate in these amendments because they in fact cannot provide waterfront access if they're not on the water. Correct?
I don't think that, because some of these don't require
Excuse me.
waterfront.
Are you through? I'm sorry. Before
Well, I'm pointing out the obvious, which is, for example, if there was a parcel on, like you said, Severn Avenue or Eastern Avenue, 3rd Street, that is not waterfront, they cannot provide waterfront access, therefore they cannot participate in this amendment, yet they are still part of the zoning of which they are. You can't, it's something there's no bridges being built,
So I can respond to that.
right?
Alderman Arnett?
Yes, so if you look at the materials from the task force, they're quite clear. In 2521, land-intensive uses, working boatyards, and services must be protected. And so the focus very clearly from the task force was on the large land-intensive maritime uses. And that is what was accepted by the city council as the strategy coming from the task force.
Okay. I think I noted earlier that from what I can tell, this legislation is really focusing on waterfront parcels within the zoning districts. I think that's a fair statement, right? Okay, so it just seems a little bit peculiar, though, I must point out, that of the WME properties, we're talking about less than 50,000 square feet in total. Would that surprise any of you?
Less than 50,000 square feet of,
Total gross commercial square footage, okay? And what the amendments the amendments and the legislation are proposing is going from 0 to 15%. That tallies up to less than 7,500 square feet for the entire WME zoning. Okay? What we're discussing now, if I'm not mistaken, is increasing for WMM from 30% to up to 55%, for WMI from 0 all the way up to 55%. Am I getting the correct gist of this?
No.
I guess,
No.
Can I, Madam Chair?
I was going to call on Ms. Bogarty, but
I can
Eric, I'm sorry.
respond as well here. I mean, the thing to keep in mind with the legislation that came out of the task force is the emphasis is on sustaining the districts, strengthening the maritime industry. The mission of the task force was not a broad-based upzoning of all the maritime districts. It was a strategic approach that looked at how can we best preserve the hub that we have, where are the strengths that we need to retain to be competitive as a maritime hub in the region on the East Coast. And what came out of the task force was this emphasis on the large land-intensive properties as the core of that. And so to the degree that some of the properties are not on the waterfront and may not be able to take advantage of the water access incentives, that was a strategic decision of the consensus that came out of the task force. That is really the emphasis that they put on this. So,
If I could just add, Madam Chair, with respect to the water access, we're talking about water access being brought into the task force as an additional category for incentive. So there are aspects of this, including renting to tenants that provide recreational access. There are certainly ways to buy into this, but the intention is to provide water access. So obviously, this incentive would focus, and it was not limited by any of the triggers. It would focus on any of the properties with water access or properties that wanted to buy into this. I think what's important in a planning effort like this, which is hugely successful, and the amendments you have today all really just make it stronger, is that the intention was never, ever to upzone or change the zoning. It was never to look at individual properties and give them more. The intention, as Eric just laid out, was for the task force, which was a mix of small businesses, large owners, residents, environmentalists, for them to determine what actions will strengthen the industry as a whole. Out of that, there is some flexibility given to the land-intensive uses because they are the uses that create the hub. The intention was never to across the board, and there was opposition to doing it across the board to upzone properties.
If I may respond.
I'd like to, I've had my hand up to try to
I'm going to call on Alderman Savage, and then I'll come
Thank
back
you.
to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to respond, so some of these incentives look like they would apply to properties that don't have waterfront. If you look at the amendment or the current language, all the category 1, all of those incentives or incentives, I should say, they would not be able to be taken advantage of by a non-waterfront. But if you look at category 2, the way I'm reading it, a non-waterfront could certainly utilize the park donation incentive, that just allows any of these properties to donate money to take advantage of that 5% per Alderman Arnett's amendment. And also the H, the community building facility. Well, I guess that won't apply because you'd have to have a launch area. But there at least is one way. But regarding the WMI, this legislation would not increase the WMI to 55%. The WMI would be capped at 20%. This would only increase 55% for the WME.
No, sir, that's not correct. Not WME.
Sorry?
You just said WME. That's not correct.
Was it WMM then? Where is it?
WMI and WME are capped at 20%.
Yeah, so this only allows WMM to go up to 55%, not WMI or the other, WME.
Okay, I'm sorry, Mr. Savage. Would you kindly repeat that? For WMI, the legislation will go from what to what?
It goes from, I believe it's 0 right now, up to 20% after all the incentives and triggers.
This is 20. Okay, understood.
Mr. Lomax?
Yes, Madam Chair. You may not have already received the referral action report from the MAB, but Tuesday evening, the MAB voted 6-0 to recommend adoption of 16 and 17. And what's of interest in that is that one of the members who voted in favor is a WME non-waterfront, one of these small non-waterfront property owners, still supported 17, and there was one member who was a WMM non-waterfront property owner who also supported these amendments. We had lively discussion about it, but they see the benefit of the amendments in the bigger picture.
Okay. Ma'am?
And so even though they would not be able to benefit from these amendments?
Absolutely. There was been a lively discussion about that, and they are content with the mandatory review, and I applaud your amendment 18, I think it was,
19.
is, or 19, that would accelerate that review, and they would be very happy with that too.
Thank you. Oh, the recommendations from the Maritime Advisory are attached, is what I'm being told.
Okay. So, Ms. Counsel, I'm sorry, just to finish my point earlier, is that the task force position appears to be that changing, well, it doesn't even appear it is that changing the commercial or office space for WMM significantly, WMI significantly, and marginally for WME will satisfy everyone. What is being overlooked is this is a zero-sum game. There is only so many square feet of commercial space in the city of Annapolis. That seems to be absent from this legislation, from this amendments, from the conversation. It can be tallied to how many square feet each of these properties has existing dedicated to commercial office space, etc. And I tallied it. And unfortunately, what is being overlooked further is the ramifications of favoring one zoning location over the other. Clearly, we're favoring WMM over WME. WMI is somewhere in the middle, although still substantially favored over WME. And I think that this is being grossly misrepresented when the task force has a position that this legislation is improving everyone and all the stakeholders. That is not the case because, as I stated previously, there is only so many square feet of existing space. So to give more to WMM will take away from WME.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alderman Arnett and
I still, first of all, I'm trying to be responsive, and you're absolutely correct. This is the time.
I'm sorry, responsive to me?
Yes.
Okay, go
This is
ahead.
the time for public to come and speak to the committee, and I'm listening to what you're saying. I am on record, and in fact had legislation long ago, actually in 2020, thinking that it is the WMM that is in the most distress. They are the part of the industry that is most impacted by the changes in the industry that have to do with people not needing hard office space, being able to operate. And I had legislation submitted to that effect. That was ultimately withdrawn because of some legal difficulties pointed out by the Office of Law and so forth. So you are correct from my perspective that this does have a strong focus on the WMM, because it feels to me, and I'm only one of 9 policymakers and voters, that's the portion of the maritime industry that is in the most distress. You will hear when we get to Amendment 19, which I am also supportive, it's coming from the chair, but we recognize that there's more to the industry, and we recognize that we need to go beyond the strategy that we've already accepted from the task force and the enhancements that we've received from the Planning Commission, and that there's more work to be done. We have Monday night to get work done in this term, and we're struggling to get this to a point where this legislation can go forward. But we're not unmindful of the point you're making, and I think that this is the very point of Alderwoman Finlayson's Amendment 19. There is more work to be done. So I hear your points. I'm not arguing them, and I think that we will get to that, but not right now.
Well, Mr. Arnett, respectfully, if not right now, then when? You did state earlier that you've instructed one of the offices to do a calculation of gross footage, square footage within the city, and how each of these zonings will be affected by this legislation. I asked you when would that be complete, and you weren't sure.
So
when can we actually expect that to be done? I'm sorry?
A debate with you, but when we get to 19, you will see that we're asking for it within the next 6 months in the new term. Within 6 months in the new term, we're asking for a work group to take up.
Okay.
Further.
Well, I'll leave with this. In the interim, in those 6 months, should this legislation go forward as you're presenting it, I'll point out to you that all of WME stands to gain 7,462 square.
Sorry.
All of WME stands to gain 7,462 square feet of office space, commercial space, whatever you want to call it, okay? General use space, okay? That is less than the space of 222.7. So as it's poised today, the city will be providing more space to one property owner in WMM than all of WME.
Thank you for your point.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Templeton, I think, was next. Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Templeton. My mic was off, but yes, please. And then Mr. Dales will be next.
Madam Chairwoman and everyone, my name is Cardi Templeton, and I'm one of the owners of 222.7. I would like to mention a bit of what Mr. Lehner was saying. We in the city as a whole in the maritime zones have vacancy, which is making it hard for all of us to maintain the buildings in a way that will be valuable to maritime or non-maritime or anyone and the tax base, right? If this legislation goes through and we get data in 6 months, we'll see how much. And that will be great. And maybe that means we can do more in the way of non-maritime without hurting the maritime. But in the meantime, what we've got right now is empty spaces, some in the WMM, some elsewhere, and the rents for maritime are going down. And so maritime tenants are moving from a less desirable place to a more desirable place, to a newer building for less money. And so the situation is getting worse for some. If we put this legislation through, and there's a more non-maritime allowed, for example, in WMM and in other zones, right? Then the maritime will be more inclined to go where there's space, which will be back in WME and WMI, right? So by providing more non-maritime opportunity in WMM, you actually increase the maritime demand other places. So things get better again for WME and WMI. Whereas right now they're getting worse because we've got big empty spaces in WMM and properties saying, please come be with me, I'll offer you a really good rate. So I do agree it's a zero-sum game at the moment because we're not building new spaces. But part of the way to solve that is by allowing more non-maritime so that the maritime needs to go where there's vacancy, right? So we can actually help each other. When it comes to 17, which I think is where we are talking right now, I'd like to mention 3 things. In category 1C, okay, as proposed by Alderman Arnett, a property can get 2.5% non-maritime under roof if they rent to a tenant that provides recreational boating opportunities to the public. Okay? It doesn't say you have to rent a slip to them. It says you have to rent to them. They may need an office space from which to operate their sales and their marketing and what have you, and they may have a slip somewhere else. So a landlocked property in one of these 3 zones, it doesn't have to have a trigger. It can just go straight for that category 1C and get 2.5%. It could rent to 2 of those tenants and get 5%. Also, they could go to category 2 if they had 150 parking spaces, and they could get 10%. They could provide however many dollars you all settle on and get whatever percent that ends up being for category 2. So certainly everything everyone has said in terms of trying to support the hubs of the working boat yards, because without those, we don't have boats and we don't have an industry. Yes, that's absolutely true. But it is not true that there are no opportunities in here for landlocked properties. Number 3, I'd like to highlight a couple of the things in 17 category 1. And say some of them offer public water access to the citizenry or visitors, right? Some of them do that and help maritime businesses, right? So for example, renting to a tenant who gets boats out on the water. In our city, unlike other harbor cities, our city dock isn't large enough to accommodate all of the businesses that like to get people out on the water. And that's what would normally happen in most harbor towns. There'd be a city dock that was large enough to provide a space for the parasailing boat, right? And a space for the pirate ship, and a space for the Annapolis fishing charters, and a space for all of them, right? That's not true in our town. So those businesses, some of which are my tenants, some of which are tenants of other marinas, go to the private marinas and they say, please, will you have us? Sometimes we say yes, sometimes we say no, but they are at our mercy. And some of them are very well run, and All of them have more people coming and going than a private boat, a privately owned boat that goes out just on weekends, right? So there's more traffic coming back and forth. There's more people traipsing across. You could argue there's more fun and energy and excitement. Or you might say it's more to manage and more liability and more whatever. So in our town, those private businesses that get people out on the water, which those are both maritime businesses themselves that provide jobs, but they're also proper opportunities to get people out on the water for $100, $20, $15, right? They are supported by that category 2. That category 1C. A water taxi, also a maritime business, right? Also a way for the citizenry or tourists or employees to get out on the water. So the category 1, there's some special value to that. I would like to suggest, and this is not a task force comment, this is Cardi Templeton personally, that because in 17, as Alderman Arnett has put forward, there is a cap to how much you can get depending on your zone total, right? I hope for WMM it becomes 55. For WME and WMI, it's sitting there at 20. There's a max. You could take the 5% limit off of category 1 so that, for example, I would be able to go and do multiples of those up to a total of 10, right? Because above the paragraph, it limits me to 50 or 55. But by putting a 5% cap on that category itself, you limit the help that I can offer to get people out of the water and to help those businesses. So if you want more public water access and you want more support for those small businesses that are not the landlords typically, that are not the property owners, right? You could consider taking the 5% cap off of category 1, knowing that I wouldn't be, or nobody would be able to go get more than, whatever the paragraph above limits us to anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Arnett?
No, Ms. Templeton and I have discussed and gone back and forth about this 5% cap, and I have carried that message back to the representatives of the task force and the Planning Commission and the staff, and that I think would be something that will be something we get to in the next round of this. I think you yourself have suggested, and I think this, by the way, I want to really compliment the Alderwoman Tierney Buckley amendments, but really to some of the people sitting at this table that actually wrote those amendments. I think a huge improvement in this legislation is the monitoring and enforcement. That is just such an incredible thing. And so you made a comment in passing that if this gets enacted, we're going to start collecting information that is going to allow us to look at what's occupied, what is occupied that is maritime, what is occupied that's not maritime, and what is vacant. And that's going to start pointing more red arrows to places where we have more work to do. And we need to give more help. And again, to Mr. Lehner, I think if that starts pointing a big arrow to the WME, those are things that will be going into the hopper for the next work group that is going to be established with Amendment 19. And that is, I think, just an incredible improvement in this legislation over as submitted. And it speaks to your point about being able to know where we need to do more things to help the industry. So I thank you.
Ms. Templeton, you were a member of the task force, were you not?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dales.
Thank you, Chair. Listen, Phil Dales at Fulton Simmons, 181 area, Parkway.
Could you turn your mic on, please?
I'll repeat that. Phil Dales, live Fulton Simmons, 181 Harry S. Truman Parkway. Thank you, Chair Finlayson. I do have one specific comment about the amendment on the floor. And my observation would be that this proposed change from $125,000 to $250,000, and then the proportionate change in the percentage of a property that could be used as non-maritime really, to me, highlights the focus on large properties and makes it obvious the focus on large properties that must have been in everyone's mind in considering these amendments and what the task force considered for potential changes. It makes no sense at all to allow a percentage increase in non-maritime of someone's square footage for the same amount of monetary contribution. That means that if a large property contributes $125,000, they receive 7,500 square feet of non-maritime, whereas if Mr. Lehner does the same, he receives like 7 times less. I think it's pretty clear that if you're going to tie a contribution that is a certain monetary amount, $125,000, to non-maritime use in a space, that space should also be a quantity rather than a percent. Now, I would propose to you that 7,500 square feet, which is approximately what Annapolis City Marina would obtain, is an appropriate amount for a $125,000 contribution. So with that in mind, the numbers would work out such that for every $25,000 contribution, someone should receive up to 1,500 square feet. And that would be fair. $25,000 from Mr. Lehner is the same as $25,000 from the Annapolis City Marina owners. Now, I wouldn't say that there's any problem with capping the amount of total square footage by percent for any given property, but at least the dollars get the same thing for any owner. The lack of fairness there is emblematic of the issues Mr. Lehner was attempting to bring to your attention. Now, we don't have the data on how much square footage in the WMM could potentially change from going to 55%. We don't have the data on how much square footage in WME may change with the 15% to 20% that could be allowed. And the same is true of WMI. But apparently that rationale was not necessary to justify the major changes that we're proposing and will likely be adopted if this goes through for the WMM. But they are necessary for some reason for the, what we know is much, much, much smaller amount of total square footage that could be changed in the WME if any of these properties could even provide the triggers. We know they can't. Most WME properties are far too small to provide the triggers as proposed. Now, those amendments that have already been discussed, I understand, have mostly been withdrawn at pressure to Mr. Schindelmeyer. So that would be amendments 12, 13, and 15, I understand, have been withdrawn. So we don't need to argue over this further with no amendment from anyone proposing that WME be allowed to participate, even given the much smaller loss of maritime space that would allow for. Now, I think that is going to be relevant if this is revisited in 6 months as proposed by what I understand is Amendment 19 or a potential resolution. And so I think that's something that I want everyone here to hear now, that whatever strategy was determined to be appropriate for changing the maritime restrictions, that strategy tipped very heavy towards helping large properties that now can convert much higher percentages of their already larger properties to non-maritime. That's, I think, likely needed to allow sustainability for maritime industry generally. But the resistance to allowing a much smaller amount of conversion should be remembered when this is revisited. So with that said, I hope that Amendment 19 or some form of it is passed to ensure that this gets revisited. And I hope that Amendment 14 will be taken very, very seriously as it helps provide these WME owners some small bit of actual relief now, as opposed to a promise to look at it again later, that you couldn't blame them for not being comfortable with, given the experience that they've had with the task force. All the issues Mr. Lehner has raised could have been addressed earlier in this process had they been better able to participate, which they very much feel they were not. So thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Nash, do you have anything you'd like to add? I see you, what appeared to you were calculating stuff over there, so.
No, I was just taking notes.
Okay, thank you. So there's a motion on the floor. We do have a motion. We do not have a motion. All this discussion and we don't have a motion on the floor? Really? You need to make sure we get our motions out first before we begin our discussion.
No.
Alderman Savage.
Okay, I'll make a motion to recommend favorably. So I do have some comments.
Second?
Okay. Further discussion, hearing none.
Oh, I would like some further discussion now.
Oh, go ahead, Alderman Savage.
Yeah, I just want to, I'm still uncomfortable with the 55% that would be a 25% increase over the original. I think 20% is a reasonable increase. And I understand the arguments where 55% is just of the business itself, the building. It's not the entire lot. And by going beyond the 50 with the incentives and triggers, we kind of help to lock in theoretically a larger maritime for the entire property. I think that's good, but my one fear with all of that, and I like some of the other changes in this amendment, besides the 55%. But my other concern is just that we're kind of creating a slippery slope. We've heard concerns from people today about, essentially wanting to increase the cap for other districts. We've had amendments that have tried to do that for all the districts to increase them even more in terms of increase the non-maritime allowance. And again, I think that's too much of a slippery slope. So that's why I feel like we should be holding the line. That's why I kind of want to hold the line, set a hard line at 50%, because I feel like every time we go beyond that, we're kind of inviting more and more encroaching and inching up beyond that, where if we can set a hard line, we're saying, no, we've set this as a policy. We don't want to even entertain any kind of discussion beyond that. That's kind of my concern. I'm not going to oppose this because this really just impacts, this particular amendment only impacts, that 55% only impacts a district in your ward, and I'll respect that. I don't know if I'll vote in favor, but I'm not going to vote no. I'll vote in favor for the sake of this committee, but in terms of the final vote, I just don't know yet, because that's kind of my concern.
Alderman Arnett?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Alderman Savage, I share a great deal of your anxiety about this, and I've had hours and hours and hours of conversations with endless number of people, but in particular, some of the people at the table. I've had conversations with my constituents as recently as a couple of hours before this meeting. I've provided you the comments from the Eastport Civic Association, which take your position, and those are my people, my constituents. But I did have the person on the ECA board that is most deeply dived into this legislation, and I explained to her the kinds of trade-offs, and I explained to her that this is for maritime, but there's also a broader picture which has to do with business viability and the fact that if we do legislation that creates vacancies, that hurts more than just the industry. That hurts employment, and it hurts our tax revenue. And I have agonized on trying to balance all of these things, and that's why I've come to submitting Amendment 17. I respect your opinion, and I share a lot of it, but ultimately I came down to I think the most good comes by adopting Amendment 17. This is not forever legislation. We already have plans with Amendment 19 to pick up the analysis. We have reporting requirements that require the city to come back and look at all of this legislation. When we come back, we will look at it armed with data, and I'm pretty sure we'll have to do some fine-tuning. So I can't tell you how I have pondered this and pondered it, and I come down where I am with Amendment 17, and would certainly appreciate your support for that in this committee, and I certainly recognize your perspective and your ability and right to make comments on it when we get to the council. And I value you as a colleague, and I respect your opinion.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, may I ask a question?
Yes, Alderman Savage.
So I wanted to ask staff and the task force, are there any other concerns with this amendment? Did you have any concerns about it undermining the entire mission of the districts or hurting the industry unintentionally? Any concerns? Or this essentially, would you see this as a friendly kind of amendment?
We do not have concerns with this amendment. The task force took a different perspective. They went with 50%, but it was highly debated. In other words, it wasn't like one person, thought it should be 55. It was something that was highly debated. The Planning Commission went with 55%. So from our perspective, me representing the task force, it's certainly within the purview of what was debated.
But what about the other changes to the incentives?
I think the other changes, the task force's perspective was 2 tiers, which is slightly different. And that is the first tier with, now the task force had a total of 5%, but the first tier, the amounts were smaller, and the second tier was considered the opportunity to get some really bang for your buck. So the one area that would be different from the perspective of the task force would be the street end park, where that was something that was considered at 10%. That would be the only area that would be a distinction.
No, I concur with what Ms. Fogarty just said. It was a very challenging decision for the task force to come to those numbers. And, I think when, although, the mission of the task force was not necessarily focused on water access, that became a very emotional topic. And so, the sort of trade-off of non-maritime for water access was a challenging discussion for them. But I think the changes that come with this amendment are generally in line with, they certainly are in line with the Planning Commission, and I think there was a body of the task force that would support them. But, Okay, and Mr. Lomax, I believe the Maritime Advisory Board has already recommended in favor of this particular amendment. Is that right?
And that's correct. And to echo what Eric just said, even on the Maritime Advisory Board, and we've been advocating for a review for 20 years, there was much debate about, over several meetings before we took it up formally, about percentages, about the concept, and they unanimously supported the Maritime Task Force strategy, and all of the 2 amendments the amendments that they did recommend favorably here were also without any nay. So we were on board. And I've worked with Alderman Arnett, Mr. Waldman, Eileen, about on some of these, I'll call them tweaks or modifications or changes, because it's a little bit like whack-a-mole. You make one change and the consequence pops up over here. And so it was a lot of what-ifs before we came down to the final amendment.
Yeah. And the Planning Commission, it sounds like this is in line with your recommendation.
The Planning Commission, I think, it thought pretty clearly that from initially the incentives were too low, and the amount of money for to get that boost, that incentive boost, was also too low. So, yes.
Okay.
Short answer.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have, Madam Chair.
Dr. Nash?
I just want to add one tiny thing. Speaking of whack-a-mole, as we changed Amendment 16 to clarify that it was the director deciding the reasonable restrictions, that language occurs as well on the second page of this amendment in the second to last paragraph. And so I would just suggest we make that consistent and also add that language as determined by the Director of Planning and Zoning after restrictions.
Would you repeat that, Dr. Nash?
So on page 2 of the amendment, under A, at the end of the sentence there where it says restrictions, I would just propose you would add as determined by the Director of Planning and Zoning, so it could be consistent with the action you took on Amendment 16.
So, Ms. Alderman Arnett, you'd accept that?
I accept that as a friendly amendment and wholeheartedly subscribe to it, as determined by...
Ms. Green, did you get it? Okay.
Good catch.
Okay, further discussion on Amendment 17? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye?
Nays, nay. All right, Amendment 18.
Oops.
Oh, that's mine.
Speaks to no, this is Savage Amendment
yes.
18. Sound system.
Would you like me to give it an explanation?
Would you like to move your amendment?
Yeah, I'd like to move favorable recommendation for Amendment 18.
Second?
Okay, discussion, Alderman Savage?
Yes, so this is, so if you turn to page, let's see, 15.
Page 15,
15, line
38 and
38.
39.
So this just applies, this would be a change only for the WMI district. And so currently it reads that in the WMI, outdoor dining may be permitted, but it says there can be no bar, no dancing, no live entertainment, no speakers or public address system shall be allowed. So what I was proposing is just to take out that entire C and put no amplified sound system shall be allowed, because I think the intention, if I'm not mistaken, is mostly for noise. People don't want the loud sound coming across the creek, and I just don't see how it would be impactful if you had people dancing without any kind of amplified music, or you could have people just unplugged, unamplified, playing a guitar, which we have had in various places in my ward. So I just thought this would be open up opportunities to at least have some reasonable, quiet entertainment.
So you simply want to delete public address system and insert,
It'd be deleting that entire 38, line 38 and 39. So delete in its entirety letter C and then put in the new letter C.
so you want to allow bar, dancing, live music, or live entertainment, and public address systems.
Yes.
Okay.
Madam Chair?
Alderman Arnett.
I'm still, so we would not prohibit a bar or dancing or live entertainment or speakers or public address system, but instead would substitute no amplified sound system shall be allowed, which implies by this change that a bar could be allowed, dancing could be allowed. and
Yeah,
live.
because I just don't see the harm in allowing that. Because I thought that the intention was mostly for noise, but I could certainly welcome any clarification from.
So if I could speak to that,
Yeah.
this is coming right out of city code for rooftop dining. And it was meant, I believe, to replicate that. I could certainly welcome Amendment 18 as an addition, like a new E or insert it, but I know that I have already received comments and concerns about people, particularly across Spa Creek, about the noise propagation from having bars and dancing and live entertainment. I'm not saying those are necessarily valid, but I do think that they're concerns. So I guess my question is, would it suffice to add another section after C, the new D, which would be no amplified sound system shall be allowed, as opposed to striking all the things that are in C, which would then make this inconsistent with city code elsewhere?
Well, no, because the way this is currently worded, you can't even have live entertainment. You can't have somebody with you can't have a clown on the property doing whatever, tying balloons for kids because it's considered live entertainment. I mean, at a restaurant, so it just seems absurd how it's currently worded. Because again, I think in terms of the complaints that you've heard from residents, I'm guessing that's mostly because of noise, right? It's not that they see people dancing or hanging out at a bar across the creek, right?
Dancing outdoors, I think, would generate general lively sound propagation from carbon units.
Well, so would having people in your backyard.
Nothing fun, in other words.
Yeah,
you know, I'm
right.
just saying, it's just-
No fun allowed.
Well, I guess, can I ask staff, and is my understanding correct, was it primarily from noise, or is it primarily coming from current other language in the code, or both?
Both comments that Alderman Arnett and you have made are both correct. It was taken from Ward 1, rooftop dining. Certainly, one could observe that your district, where the sites are 17 to 20 acres, is a very different situation than Ward 1, but the language was initially taken from Ward 1, where you have a much more cheek and jowl type of situation.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we would not have opposition to this.
Actually, it was taken from Ward 8 that it was the rooftop dining for Blackwall Hitch that propagated an incredible amount of debate back and forth and led to limits to hours and limits to amplified sound. But it does apply. In Ward 1, there have been applications from time to time for rooftop dining. I think there are a couple spaces. And again, I think Ms. Fogarty is correct. When your neighbors are right next door, it's a lot different than when your neighbors are just boats moored at the slip in the WMI.
Yeah. I think we need to show Alderman Arnett the movie Footloose about the importance of dancing.
Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, do we have a motion on the floor?
Yes.
To give a favorable recommendation to Amendment 18? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
I will be consistent, no.
I'm a no also. I'd like to come back and discuss this further, but I'd really rather be consistent with the code elsewhere. And so I'm sorry I can't support this.
Okay, I thought I called the question, but let me do it again. All in favor of a favorable recommendation for Amendment 18, please say aye.
Aye.
Nay?
Nay.
Nay. Okay. The last amendment, please let it be the last amendment.
It's not.
You know, I have a strong belief that if we have legislation before us and it has to be amended 5 times, 10 times, 15 times, heaven forbid, 20 times, it wasn't ready for prime time to begin with. So now we're on Amendment 19.
Yes.
Which is my amendment.
I would make a favorable move that we recommend favorably on Amendment 19.
Thank you. Do I get a second?
I'll second it, but I'm not sure how I'm going to vote yet.
Okay. I came to this amendment as a compromise. As I said the last time, and I'm going to try not to repeat myself, while the task force has done a phenomenal job, I'm very disturbed that nevertheless, a group of our businesses are left out, whether by our fault and not being more inclusive or for whatever reason. And I think there should be some effort to get everybody to a point where there is some satisfaction across the board. There is some consideration across the board. And so my proposal is that we give, in 6 months, there's far more words here than in my original submission, so grant me for one moment. This should say that within 6 months of the passing of this legislation, the Planning and Zoning Director shall create a group to analyze the impact and make recommendations on the impact of the small maritime operators. And if this does go to a resolution, which it very may, I'm going to be even more specific to say who should make up that work group. And I strongly believe that it should be represented by not only the large operators, but the small operators, the industry, and the residents. So at least 4 groups. And I think the law department has convinced me that we only need 1 representative from each group. I had originally thought 2. They said 1 is good. So that's what's going to be outlined in the resolution. So what you have before us now is Amendment 19, my compromise to get us to a good place. Not that we're not in a good place, but a better place. Alderman Arnett and then Alderman Savage.
Madam Chair, first of all, I appreciate your willingness to compromise, and I also share, and I was receptive to listening to Mr. Lehner. I think there is more work to be done. The sense of this, as I take it, is that with the adoption of the ordinance, we will immediately task the planning department to come up with a work group. You can probably refine that more with a resolution that will give some additional analysis for this group within 6 months of the passage of this legislation, which may or may not be Monday night, but in any event. So I totally support this and would add my name as co-sponsoring it with you, and will support it at the City Council.
Thank you. Alderman Savage?
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of my concerns was about the stakeholders, but I'm glad to hear, sounds like that'll be addressed in the resolution in terms of who's going to be participating. But I guess to back up, though, I'm not entirely sure it's accurate to say that the small businesses were left out of the process. I mean, my understanding is they were invited to be a part of the process, right? And did any of them attend to participate? Did they go to any public hearings at the Planning Commission, at the City Council, or to the Maritime Task Force?
We had on the task force, out of the 36 people, 12 were small businesses and small operators who were active on the task force. We had, through Marine Trades, about another 30 of these small tenants and small businesses who interacted with them for direct input. And of course, anybody, including some of the people who spoke today and the last time, who had issues, were those ideas, we indicated directions that we thought they could go, so yes.
Mr. Lomax, are you answering his question?
I am. As I mentioned earlier, on the Maritime Advisory Board, also, we had 2 property owners, neither of which were waterfront property owners, but had maritime businesses, one in WME and one in WMM, one on Severn Avenue, one on Eastern Avenue, who participated in all of our discussions.
And what about the Planning Commission? Was there anything? I saw you nodding.
There were several members of the task force who attended the hearings and the presentations to the Planning Commission, but we did not hear from any of the witnesses who've testified here before this committee, and we never got anything, certainly never got anything timely from their representative, and because we met virtually, we had one hearing, and then 2 weeks later we had another hearing, and then the third time is when we discussed findings and so forth. But there were people on the task force who were definitely small businessmen who did, but hadn't heard any of these concerns.
Okay, because that's I mean, it sounds like they've had opportunity to comment. They've participated and been a part of the task force. I don't want to, I feel like we're rewarding people who have gone, they're deliberately trying to bypass the process, bypass the collective group that has put all this effort in to get their own needs, what they see as their own needs met. And I don't want to reward that because they went on their own, got their own separate attorney. When you've had probably more than those people, small businesses participating on the task force as is, right? So why are we talking about creating a whole parallel process just for these two folks who are complaining about that? I mean, they had an opportunity. I just don't think that's a right way to go here.
Well, may I, before I call on Mr. Nolan, may I give you the other side of that coin? Because I see this as giving everybody a voice, even if they had an opportunity. And I don't want to get too deep into this, but I could. To be inclusive at any point in the game, I would hope that all of our residents, even after the process has begun, for them to feel they have an opportunity to still be heard. And if they have legitimate concerns, that we take those concerns into consideration. You know, too many times we close the door because the process is over. Well, as a city, we should not do that. As a city, we should be concerned about everybody's concerns. And so wherever it is in the process, and that's why we have these meetings. You know, that's why the Planning Commission has its hearings. Everybody's not going to come to the Planning Commission. That's intimidating. That's intimidating for us sometimes. So average Joe, not going to show up there. But that's a whole nother issue. So there is another side to that, you know, an open process, you know, and giving opportunity for folks to say, well, it's not too late for me to speak up. And we do want to hear every voice. So
yeah, I don't disagree. But where's the average Joe? Because I think the two people who testified are not exactly your average Joe. They're people who did have an opportunity to participate, and I think they are doing this particularly for that reason, to try to get, and I agree with you that people can always come to testify, and that's right. I mean, but we do have that built into the legislation in terms of an annual review. We are going to revisit this, but you're talking about creating this whole separate task force, taking up more of staff's time for something which seems to be more of a straw man than an actual shortcoming of the task force.
I would disagree with you. And everybody involved in this process, at least people who speak to us. Thank you, Ms. Templeton, for being here on more than one occasion. I'm so sorry. That's quite all right.
Hey, this was Cardi. I got a call from Robbie.
Oh, good.
I'll follow up with, oh yeah, thank you for that.
See, we stop and we hear no matter what it is or when it is, okay? But many have said, we're rushing this. Everybody's not been included. It's a political process and it's election year, you know, so we are where we are. I am proposing this amendment as a compromise to hear from folks who maybe they were heard from in the spring and maybe they weren't. You know, and I'm not going to get into that because I wasn't part of it, and neither were you. But I'm saying we should be open as we can possibly be. So that's what my amendment is for. And Mr. Nolan, it's your turn.
Thank you. First of all, Madam Chair, I do agree everything ought to be open and inclusive and transparent. But what I feel I have to do, representing the entity that really started this whole thing 2.5 years ago, is that we started a process the minute that Annapolis City Marina found out that it was going to lose roughly half of its 75,000 square feet of tenants in the building, and it all was for political reasons because there was a new administration at that time, which we don't need to get into. The tenants didn't want to go, but somebody up in the wonderful town of Washington, D.C. decided otherwise. So that's what started this whole process. And as I stated, when we addressed this before the city council on the issue of the strategy from the Maritime Task Force. Discussions that started with the mayor, went to Alderman Arnett because it's his district. We're simply referring to professional office space tenants in office space that already existed. And again, I would emphasize that I've heard these statements that not everybody is treated the same. Well, my goodness, zoning is that way. You got different zoning districts in this very city. They're all different. Somebody over here doesn't get what somebody over there gets. I mean, this is very normal. And there's like this pretend argument that somehow this is not the right thing. Not necessarily true. But be that as it may, when this whole process started, the focus was on the WMM, and it was simply professional office space users, nothing else. And Alderman Arnett was trying to work through something that would deal with that, because, quite frankly, we are his constituents also. But he came up with an ordinance, and for technical reasons, it didn't stay in the queue. At that point, there was a lot of discussion about, let's finally, after 34 years, take a look at what's going on with all the maritime districts. But it must be noted that every one of them is different. Under the existing law, it's only the WMM that is allowed to have any professional office space use, period. So others in other zones said, we'd like to receive some consideration for that, and then other things came out of that. At the end of the day, there was a decision made, let's appoint a task force. The city council voted to do that. You entrusted this task force, which was quite diverse, quite broad, huge. And I commend the task force and Eileen Fogarty for chairing that and moving that forward, because it was like, working with a Rubik's Cube, quite frankly. Where do we end up here and how do we get there? But I'm going to tell you, somebody who's been watching this process for 2.5 years, including paying attention to what was before the Maritime Task Force. How was it comprised? When it was created, it was with the idea to deal with immediate issues and then long-term issues. And I would suggest to you some of the issues that have been raised by others who came to the podium at the last meeting and today are in the latter category, not the former category. And with that backdrop, the Maritime Task Force heard from everybody, and they heard from these people, I guarantee it. When it went to the Planning Commission, we sat in on the meetings, and Mr. Dales spoke at those meetings about these same issues. And I'm not speaking as to in favor or against what they're trying to do. I have no comment on that. What I am saying is, for anyone to suggest that this process has not been open and not transparent and people have not had an opportunity to be heard is just nonsense, period. And I am happy to describe that further at some other time. But so it did go through the Planning Commission, and I remember specifically the attorney for this group that's speaking spoke at the Planning Commission, because I sat there and listened to him, and quite frankly, it was the same pitch that you've heard today. The other part of the problem, and I agree with Alderman Savage, it's like, it doesn't make sense to me that this matter came before the strategy that was adopted by the task force, came before the city council just a couple of weeks ago. There was no one from that group who came and testified on the issue that they're talking about at this time before the city council when you all went ahead and voted in favor of the strategy, which I found odd. Number one. Number two, there was no one there there at that time to comment to the city council on moving 02521 ahead. No one from that group. And then next thing that happens is we're here at the Rules Committee. At the first meeting of your Rules Committee, all right? no one was here and there were no amendments. And it wasn't until right before the second Rules Committee meeting that amendments, what are they, 12, 13, 14, 15, appeared. And that's when this discussion started. I was very tempted at the last meeting to stand up. I don't know that it would have been appropriate, and that's why I didn't do it, because I do believe in process and protocol. But it was problematic to hear that situation being portrayed as people who haven't been heard, have been disenfranchised, when honestly, they have been part of the process all the way through. All that being said, I think that the task force recommendation initially when the task force was created was to consider the issue that's really covered by 02521 quickly and get it done. And the quickly, I guess you all think 6 months or so is quick. I don't, but here we are, and we're finally almost there. I do think that there are longer term issues, not only what was raised by the smaller property owners, but also the issues about creating funding, creating tax incentives, and all those sorts of things. All of that should be looked at, and I know that that will happen going forward. But I just have to stand to echo what Alderman Savage is saying, that I think this process has been eminently fair. I give great credit to the task force. I give great credit to the staff. They have really pushed the rock up the hill, if you will, and here we are. So with that in mind, I trust that there will be numerous things in the future that should be considered, and this should be an ongoing monitored process. But fair is fair, and I think it's been very open and very transparent, and I commend all the folks who've been part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion? Alderman Savage?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just quick comment on the overall task force focus. So I know it's been commented that they've focused on the larger businesses, and I think that is true, because I think we need to point out the letter from Susan Zeller with the Maritime, what's the group? Maritime Industry Trades Group. Because the whole point is these larger businesses are really the anchors. We need those to have a viable maritime industry. And so, of course, we have to save them and do what we can to improve those properties. And I think we can't lose sight of, if we lose them, on the one hand, we lose over 100 small businesses that are tenants in these properties. Those are the small businesses where you get the diverse representation, all kinds of different sizes and interests, but it's all focused on the maritime. But two is, if you lose those large anchors, it also undermines our entire maritime industry. We lose everything. We risk losing everything at that point. And that was the clear message sent from Ms. Zeller. And so that was my problem with those Schandelmeyer amendments, which you did support, is that's what the fear is, the worry is, if those amendments pass, it undermines the entire process, and not just the process, the entire maritime district. That's the danger of it. So that's why there was this focus on large businesses.
You said your fear, and I got that. Amendment 19, does it, in your mind, undermine what the task force has done?
I think it does, because it accepts the argument that they did not have a fair process that did not include the small businesses, and I think it did.
Okay.
And you're essentially undermining the efforts of staff and the entire task force who put in saying they did not include these people, and they did. And I don't think that's right to do.
I agree with you. I feel very differently, though. We appreciate the work that they've done, and there's a piece of it that's left out that we're trying to address, and that's how I'm going to view it. So, thank you. Mr. Lomax?
Yes, just one comment. The Maritime Advisory Board, we actually been making notes of, and I've been taking notes today, of ways that we can assist in, I'll call it the outliers. Not necessarily small businesses, but the outliers. And I have a scribbled list here, and I was not expecting that it would come up in 6 months, but I was looking towards the fact that I know there's written into the legislation, much needed mandatory review. And whether that takes place in 6 months or whether that takes place by December of '23, I have no personal preference on that one way or the other. What I do want to say is that the Maritime Advisory Board is aware of the problem and would work with any group, whether it's short-term, long-term, whatever, again, in trying to resolve issues that are affecting these outliers.
Well, thank you for that, and maybe you would be a candidate for this new committee.
My
Be
wife
careful
keeps-
of what you ask for.
My wife keeps telling me, do not volunteer again. I've been at it too long. But no, I'd be happy to, or and there's other members. In fact, 1 or 2 of our members are in this outlier category, and I'm sure they would certainly want either participate or at least want to contribute their thoughts.
Thank you. Alderman Arnett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we're ready to vote, but I was going to say, I know we could get this done in 6 months if Dr. Nash changes her mind and decides to stay.
This would really be the motivator to keep her here, right? Well, maybe she can get us started before she leaves. That would be terrific. And I have to say, Dr. Nash, I'm heartbroken that you're leaving, but I'm happy for you, so.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for your support over the years.
So, all right, further discussion about 19 before we go on to other things. Okay, all in favor of Amendment 19, please say aye.
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 No.
Opposed?
No.
Okay.
Madam Chair?
Oh, yes, am I going to entertain a motion to, you have another amendment?
No, I don't, but there are some house cleaning issues that I'd like to bring up with the staff. First one, and I forgot to mention it when we were back on.
Alderman, let me stop you for a moment. Are these amendments to 025? We don't have a category of housekeeping, so what?
Well, but these are things that I want to make sure are included, and you have it on your table. It's this half-page worth of things. I just want to make sure that they're captured by staff in the work that we've done. And so in Amendment 2, we had stayed with 5%, and I want to make sure that we've now changed it to go to 10% on pages 4, lines 6, 7, and 8. That would be consistent with Amendment 17. And then on...
Alderman, let's stop right here. I'm looking at our notes for Amendment 2.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what line it is. This is under Category 2.
Let me get Amendment
I'm not sure this
2.
is the correct process.
Yeah, I had the same question. I'm not sure how to handle these.
Ms. Green, do you have because I'm seeing add Amendment 2. We can't add something to Amendment 2 without amending Amendment 2. So what are we looking at? We want to insert, you're suggesting we strike 5% on page 4, lines 6, 8, and 11? This is under Category 2?
I really am suggesting that these, and Mr. Nolan wants to speak to, these are things that we need to tweak as a result of Amendment 17 that are in Amendment 2.
So then these will become new amendments.
Pardon me?
These will become new amendments.
Well,
You can't change.
I know. Well, I just want to make sure that we understand that once we've voted for Amendment 17, these things have to be cleaned up. I think Dr. Nash and the staff.
Mr. Nolan's raising his hand. Yes, sir?
Yeah, if I can, because I know that Alderman Arnett and I have talked about this a number of times as we've talked with staff. I think the first item, Alderman Arnett, is already taken care of because of your Amendment 17.
Good.
Okay, so I think that document was created after or prior to the first Rules Committee meeting. But because of your Amendment 17, which was enacted today, the first item there is already done,
Okay,
okay? It's the second item that would be really under Amendment 3. When it was taken up the other day, it appears there was discussion because staff raised the issue of the second item there, okay?
Well, may I interrupt you for a moment? If this is an addition, which what I'm reading,
No.
it says add underline to existing proposed amendment. That means it's an amendment,
I think that.
which means
what-
we're going to have to treat it as an amendment.
No, I withdraw that. We'll just make that. It's
Is
already.
it something the law department or Dr. Nash
it's moot.
could work out the details of?
It's a moot point. Yeah. It's a
I
moot
believe it
point.
was already added to one of the Tierney amendments.
Right.
That's right. If you go to the Tierney-Buckley amendments that are on Legstar, I believe that underlined portion is in Amendment 3 currently.
If I may, all that was discussed, and I know that it was brought up at the last meeting, it just didn't appear in the printed document later, but Amendment 3, it says on page 5 in line 37, after the period, insert, quote, any community benefits, specifically parking, comma, required by the BPD must be continued, end quote. That was approved at the Rules Committee meeting number 2, but there was some language that was to follow the word continued, which was brought up, but it doesn't appear that it made it into the amended document. And that
It is in the document, Mr. Noel.
Okay, and that would be
All
just,
On page 3, the document I'm looking at,
done.
it has,
well, no,
so dramatic,
Can
it
I-
has the underlined section
it's already in?
in it.
Okay.
Yes.
Staff has just said it's been put back in.
Okay.
And under the guise, while I'm up here, if I may have leave, there were, speaking about whack-a-mole, you do this, result that. There were 2 other things which were discussed before this meeting with Alderman Arnett and I believe staff, and that's in Amendment 5 in Part F that was approved before, that there was a reference WMM maximum 55% was proposed at the last meeting. It was knocked down to 50%, consistent with that discussion, but then consistent with the adoption of Amendment 17 today. I believe the not housekeeping, but that 55% should be reinstated. It should be 55 and not 50% to be consistent.
Well,
And
these amendments, the ones you're referring to, the Tierney-Buckley amendments, that's what we passed. So we can't go back and change
but you passed them, I believe,
at
and not
50%.
at 50%.
Right.
Where they should have been, given Amendment 17, put back to 55%. And the same thing in Amendment 8 on page 17, line 10. It had strike maximum 50%, go to maximum 55. At the Rules Committee last time, that was kept at 50, and because of Amendment 17, that should also go back to 55.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but that's not, I don't think that's how the process works. We approved the amendments as they were written in 3, 4, whichever one this is. And then we approved another amendment, number 17. So when we get to the floor, whichever one passes, that's the language that will supersede.
Well, I understand, but that doesn't take into account, and the whack-a-mole theory.
Welcome to our world.
The percentage, 50 to 55 percentage issue in Amendment 5 and Amendment 8 just needs to be clarified if the Amendment 17 in effect passes.
Yeah.
Okay?
If that passes, then the language will be changed across the board.
Terrific.
Yes, thank you. Alderman Savage.
I just want, maybe we want to ask the Office of Law to look at it. If all the amendments end up passing, at least that we've recommended, are there going to need to be additional amendments created to address Mr. Nolan's concern, which is just make sure everything is
We would be able to do it on the floor.
right. I know, I'm just saying, if law could take a look ahead of time, they'll be able to prepare something ahead, so we don't have to do it on the floor. If they see a potential conflict with the
Well,
amendments.
they should be prepared, as well as Dr. Nash, to help us at the meeting.
Right, I mean, fortunately, we have Jacqueline Lee on the case, so I think she will make sure that the things are being consistent. We'll just have to make sure that if a subsequent amendment amends a previous amendment, that language is consistent. And if we're all mindful of that as we're going and not too tired because it's 3 o'clock in the morning, then we will be good.
Okay, so we're well aware, and we'll be following up and asking the right questions of Dr. Nash and Mr. Lyles during the meeting. Okay,
Madam Chair, I can't believe it. I think we're done.
and we have 33 minutes to go. No, we don't.
Before you move on, you need a final vote for the,
I'm sorry?
you need a final vote for the overall.
Oh, yes.
We did, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll entertain a motion to approve 025 as amended.
I recommend that the Rules Committee recommend to the City Council approving 02521 as amended.
Second.
All right, further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay.
I think we
Thank you
need-
very much.
We need to give staff and all the other participants another thank you.
Absolutely.
This has been a long and arduous
Harrowing.
journey. So we do appreciate it.
Thank you, yes.
And I think
All right.
maybe Eileen can have a decent weekend this weekend. Maybe.
Okay, I will entertain a motion to adjourn the final rules committee for this term.
So moved.
We're not having another meeting.
So moved.
Second,
Okay, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
I fervently
All right.
hope we're all back on rules in December.